Presiding Officer, the Government motion begins with an absurd, unqualified condemnation of the budget, and I will return to that towards the end if I have got time. But I want to focus first of all on two distortions of reality that follow in the motion, distortions that may be quite good politics but are certainly appalling economics. The first is the statement that the debt situation is the product of poor financial management, and yet it is very difficult to see what the SNP would have done in a similar situation given the international economic difficulties that they face. One element, a key element of the budget deficit clearly is the fiscal stimulus and the money to save the banks, but we know that the SNP government support that. I will give way to Derek Brownlie.
Brian Light.
Of course, another key element of the problem in terms of debt is that this Labour government doubled national debt before we went anywhere near a recession, before we had to rescue any bank.
Welcome,
I go on to that as I analyse the budget deficit, but I should point out with reference to the Tories that of course they didn't support the fiscal stimulus, but the fact of the matter is that the 4% contraction of the economy this year would have been far more without a fiscal stimulus, and one leading economist has estimated it would be as much as 8%. The second, and indeed more substantial element of the budget deficit is what are called the automatic stabilisers. Public expenditure has to go up to deal with unemployment and other features of the recession, and even the Conservatives, of course, would have had to accept that, and indeed they would have had far more to pay because there would have been far more unemployment. The third element of the budget deficit is the lost tax revenues, and of course there are grounds for concern here. The Institute of Fiscal Studies analysis points out that there is a structural budget deficit now because there has been what they regard as permanent damage to the economy because of the recession, particularly because of the effect on the financial sector. That is a deep worry for us all, but it certainly cannot be attributed to any poor financial management by the government. And the fact of the matter is, if the government had not saved the banks, it would have been a whole lot worse, and the budget deficit would have been a great deal more. So where exactly is the poor financial management? Derek Brownlie referred to earlier years, but for all the years between 1997 and 2008, the UK government kept debt below 40% of GDP. And I certainly did not hear from the SNP during the last 10 years, or come to think of it from the Conservatives in this Parliament, complaints about the growth of public expenditure. In fact, many of them were calling for more. So I do not think that the statement, the blaming of the Labour government for the deficit in terms of poor financial management has any shred of truth in it whatsoever. Now, of course, there are elements of the fiscal stimulus that I think both the Scottish Government and the Conservatives disagree with, well, at least I should say sections of the SNP, and that is the VAT element of the fiscal stimulus. I do not think I need to repeat what Andy Kerr has already said about that. The fact of the matter is, and I will just refer to one of the bodies that is analysed at the Centre for Economics and Business report, they have said that it will be between £8 and £9 billion higher turnover this year because of that. And clearly that has been a very substantial benefit to the economy, and in fact those higher sales will themselves generate higher taxes, and so the overall cost at the end will probably be less than the £12.5 billion that was announced when it was introduced. Now, of course, the second distortion that we have heard repeatedly over the last few weeks is the idea that a £500 million reduction will lead to real terms cuts next year. Firstly, of course, it is not £500 million unless you include the health capital expenditure, which has been dealt with by the UK government in terms of end-year flexibility. But setting that aside, it will not lead to real-term cuts. And again, I do not know if I really need to go over all the arguments that have been very well put by various speakers already. But the fact of the matter is you can only arrive at the idea of a real-terms cut by taking the brought forward capital expenditure as something that is only in this year's budget. We have to look at capital expenditure over 2 years. In that way, it is as planned. And I think the best way I can illustrate the real situation is by referring to page 241 of the Government Treasury's Red Book, which the First Minister himself used as his main ammunition last week to establish a cut. Now, if we take out the capital expenditure, because we all know that funny games are being played with in regard to that by the Scottish Government, if we ignore that and look at resource expenditure, which is what people are for the most part, worried about in terms of everyday health and education budgets and so on. According to that same page, quoted by the First Minister, there is a 1.3% real terms increase in resource expenditure for the Scottish Government next year. So, yes, of course, nobody wants to have reductions in public expenditure, but surely in this debate, the SNP can at least give us some little hint of what action they would take to rein in the budget deficit. Now, of course, they have mentioned Trident and ID cards, and colleagues won't be surprised that I agree with John Swinney on that, and so does my former colleague Stephen Byers. But the fact of the matter is that that would not help the problem that is being described by the Cabinet Secretary. Any money for Trident doesn't start till 2012, it's spread over 10 years, and so to actually pretend to the Scottish public that that would deal with all of these issues is quite dishonest. Now, my time is up. I wanted, of course, to deal with the many good points of the budget that are ignored by the motion, but I leave it to other of my colleagues to talk about those.